Good morning.
Good morning, Carl.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good morning, professors.
Good morning, Ray. How are you?
Hey, Ray, how's it going? Bob, I may need to step out for a second toward the front end of this.
Okay,
I've got an
that's
HVAC
fine.
guy who showed up early today. He wasn't supposed to come
well,
till this
that's good
afternoon.
to have him. Good to have
Yeah.
him.
We had to have the whole system replaced.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it was not fun. Yeah, it was not fun, but we're in a lot better shape now.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can hear you now.
Ah, there we go.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning,
Good
Charles.
to see you. Thanks for joining us.
No problem. How's it going, Carl?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
Missing you guys.
Yeah, it's been rough. It's kind of lonely.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Hey, really sweet CPO challenge coins, Elliot, is showing online.
Yeah. I think they're trying to branch out with sales and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I saw that. I was kind of surprised that they were actually selling them, but yeah, the billet head one was really cool.
Oh yeah.
Well, we have picked actually the coldest days of the year to have you guys aboard the ship present. So it's an unbroken string so far. So really appreciate you doing this. And let's see, we might as well begin. I know people will be joining us as they can, but really delighted to have Petty Officer Hardmon with us this morning from the deck of the Constitution. Actually, you're outside the captain's quarters, I believe. So this is really a pleasure to meet you virtually. And I'm Professor Allison. And so,
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Allison, for giving me this opportunity, and I appreciate the invite here, and it does not go unappreciated. So thanks for having me on here, and it seems like I'm in good company, especially with Carl representing the Constitution Museum. So
he is. We've been having a fun semester so far. I think I don't know about the students, but they've been learning a lot about the ship, and they've made some really cool videos about artifacts they've found in the museum. And so, Petty Officer Hardmon's, one of his specialties is the construction of the ship, the harvesting of live oak, and also you are a career naval career sailor so far.
right. Yeah, that's the plan. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think you're wearing a more sophisticated uniform than we have seen other sailors wear. Can you tell us a little bit about the hat and the outfit?
Yeah, so the sailors, and I'm hoping that Carl can hopefully back me up on this, but sailors often would wear what they were given or what could be made or what was passed down to them. But most of the time, being a sailor during that time, or at least during the War of 1812 and maybe sometimes before and after, it was a fashionable thing to be. Sailors were, I guess, some of the coolest people that were walking the docks at that time. So it was very appropriate to look good. So this is a little bit more formal in terms of the way I'm wearing my jacket, a wool jacket, kind of done up with buttons, and kind of the pop collar and the hat for style. Obviously not functional for sailing, but just basically looking good at what you're doing. So when you're out at sea, it's going to be looking a lot different. But obviously Constitution is docked here. She's taking a break, and it's time for me to get fancy. So
yeah.
Yeah, actually, Charles, that's actually a really interesting point. And so surprisingly, like a number of the things that you're wearing right now do reflect sort of a utility. And it might be fun to like take a look and imagine compared to what you would normally be wearing, you know, in a billet on another ship. The tall hat seems kind of like a little dysfunctional, right? Like it would blow off. But you're not, you know, an ordinary seaman or an able-bodied seaman who's going to be up in the rig, right? Like your
Right.
role as a chief petty or a petty officer is going to be on the deck. And so you'll see an imagery of the time period of a lot of those commissioned officers, as well as the warrant officers, the petty officers wearing covers like this. And, you know, the upturned brim did in fact help keep away rain coming off. And the coat, although it looks a lot more formal, has this fold up collar that actually is really great at keeping out wind. And it's a woolen jacket too. So in the pre-Gore-Tex days, this was, you know, this was a pretty good advantage for both cold and some moisture. Charles,
Right.
what do you, can you explain to the students for a second, what's your normal role in the Navy before you came to Constitution? And can you explain your rank and rate?
Absolutely. So I'm a petty officer first class, and that would be E6 in terms of the enlisted pay grades and ranks, ranking from E1 to E9. So I'm on my way. I'm at E6 for now, but my job or rate in the Navy is a naval air crewman, which allows me to be an operator in the Navy, to fly on board naval aircraft. And in my particular case, I flew on board Navy helicopters. So I've about 1,000 hours flying on board Navy helicopters. And yeah, it's very different from what I was doing, kind of more op tempo, high op tempo, deploying about every 9 months. But after that, after sea duty is over, you come here to shore duty, and it's just a crazy kind of shift in terms of style and job responsibilities. But kind of coming from the new age Navy kind of aviation style, helicopter hands-on, to more of the representing the historical aspects of the Navy where we began. So I really appreciate like kind of how I've done that so far in my career. So, but yeah, I'm a naval air crewman.
You know where you
How
go
long-
next?
Next stop for me, I depart here in May. I'm going to be going to Japan, Sasebo, Japan, and
Wow.
I'm going to be working for an 06, a Commodore out there, and mainly kind of a part of a staff that represents multiple ships and aircraft.
Wow. How long have you been on Constitution?
So this May coming up will be 3 years exactly. So I'm 2 months away. So it'll be about 3 years worth of a tour, and it's flown by. It's crazy.
Yeah. And how do you go from, so you enlisted as an ordinary seaman or as an E1 and you rose, or can you tell us a little bit about the process of getting to where you are now?
Definitely. So air crewman in the Navy never used to be its own rate or job specific rate. In fact, it used to be something that you would earn as a warfare designator. So I could come into the Navy as an aviation boatswain mate and then earn the right or qualify to fly along with my job title. But in about 2004, they broke those apart, and now naval air crewman became a rate of its own. So they had to start filling in billets or filling in people into those rates. And when that was happening, I happened to be joining the Navy at that time, and they offered me to be an air crewman from the start. So I trained right into becoming a flying sailor.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Does anyone else have questions for Mr. Hardmon?
So Charles, given all that you just explained, can you, we know that you've specialized in learning a lot more about Constitution's construction and that history. What drew you to that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to tell you the truth, Carl, just absolutely love history. And I know that usually the stories and all of the facts that come to light are some of the more grandiose ideas in terms of naval victories and naval heroes, and that's always on the forefront. And I'm always interested in kind of going behind the scenes or reading kind of like through some of the big pictures and seeing where things began and how it all started, because that's the reason why we're here, the history is why we're here. So just learning about the construction, and a big shout out to Margarita Desi, who's our NHHC kind of point of contact, go-to lady. We really miss her because she provides a lot of information and a lot of she helps fill in the gaps for a lot of the history. So when I started asking her more questions about where Constitution comes from and why and the what, that's when I really started to take my own dive deeper to look or to learn about Constitution's construction. So yeah, that's kind of where the post originated from. I know that it was a spotlight more on my career in terms of just celebrating kind of Black History Month in February. And that's why I kind of highlighted some of the facts that, African Americans do have an impact on the construction of US's Constitution. Whether or not it's highlighted or not, it's still something that should be brought to light and shared as commonly as the big pictures are usually shared. So
I don't think the students have read the post. So can you tell us a little bit about what you said?
Yeah, so the post originally began talking about my career and what it means for me to serve. And what I represent, or what I would like to represent, is the fact that African Americans at the time were underrepresented in the construction of US's Constitution. So when Constitution was planned, and all the ideas and all the blueprints and designs were being assembled, they knew what type of wood they wanted to use for certain parts of the ship. And the true secret ingredient of Constitution and her construction and her strength and her lore comes from the live oak that is harvested from the deep, deep South, St. Simon's Island in Georgia, southeastern Georgia. So that wood, as you know, oak in general, is just very, very heavy and very difficult to harvest. And it's just a very tough wood to harvest. So New Englanders and everybody else that had the hands in building Constitution tried themselves to go down and cut that wood. And it just proved to be so difficult that, a lot of them were just either dying from exhaustion, catching malaria, and just really having a tough go at cutting this dense wood down. Not only is it really hard wood, but it's resting in these swampy, marshy areas that's just really hard to haul it out of. So what ends up happening is eventually the jobs are leased out to, slave owners, plantation owners for the indentured slaves or slaves with, absolutely no rights, where those people were acclimated to the environment at the time. And, they were used to the toiling in that heat and in the areas, so that they chopped the wood down, and then they were able to haul it through the marshes and load it onto the ships. So Constitution has this great story that, whether or not we choose to, highlight the little people or the big people, I just think we need to really start blending the story and telling everything that leads to why Constitution is great, why her sides are made of iron, and the story just needs to be shared. So I love to bring to light all of what people think that they know or don't know. But once again, it was just maybe a homage or a pay tribute to the people, the small people, the insignificant people at the time that didn't get the shine. So that's really what the post is all about, in not so many words. So
we have, I don't know, you might already know this, Charles, but just for the benefit of the students, we at the museum got a grant last year from the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities to begin looking into this story of these essentially enslaved people who were really leased, rented to the Navy, U.S. Navy, to go harvest this timber. There are archival records on St. Simon's, in a couple other state archives in Georgia and North Carolina, and actually even in New York, that have original records pertaining to the businesses, the owners of the landowners down there who were working with the Navy on this. But unfortunately, because of COVID, our travel has been completely cut off. And so in the coming year, we've put the whole project off a year, but in the coming year, we'll actually be going down and looking at firsthand records and hoping to actually find these people, find out more about the enslaved people who were on St. Simon's and the role that they played. Academics that I've spoken to that already have more depth of research in this field in general have said that for plantation owners and other enslavers at that time period, essentially renting the enslaved people to the government was something they considered a good deal, because any injury or death that was sustained by those workers constituted a loss of property that they could then sue the government for restitution for. So it was almost an insurance policy that came in addition to a loss of income. But in the meanwhile, because it became so commonplace, there is this untold story of this role of enslaved Black Africans in particular, and Afro-Caribbean people who were fundamentally responsible not only for ship construction, but a lot of other early federal government projects.
Wow, that's interesting.
It is. And we also know there were African Americans actually serving aboard the ship during all of this period when the Army was segregated. I wonder if either you or Carl can speak at all about that experience, if you've had a chance to look into that.
Yeah, so Carl will be able to talk a little bit more about some of the absolutes in terms of how the crew was comprised. But once again, these are questions that I would always ask the museum, and Margarita, our Naval History and Heritage Command kind of specialist, and she would always allude to the fact that yes, there were African Americans serving on board, and yes, they were free men, but did they enjoy some of the same privileges and some of the same treatments as, let's say, a white sailor or anybody that wasn't depicted as Black? So yes, they were definitely on board, and unfortunately, the records are really hard to dig up in terms of what their names were and some of their jobs, because most of the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, Carl, most of the time they were often put in registers or on muster reports as like with their names featuring facial features or how they were recognized. For instance, I would be maybe like Charles Long Chin or something like that, or something along those lines, where it was really hard to describe somebody exactly. And that's what really makes some of the record finding super difficult. But yeah, black sailors definitely on board USS Coast.
Yeah, we have a couple different. We've done a wide range of research on this, and one of the difficult things is that, as you're saying, Charles, the muster rolls that brought sailors on board actually didn't provide didn't provide any indication of their physical characteristics or look, much less a definition of race. And so we have no idea just from those primary records. When you join the Marine Corps, they actually put down a summary of sort of physical descriptions, but it was usually things like, complexion, dark, hair color, black, brown. And so you really have to try and extrapolate, kind of unsuccessfully in that regard. We have ballparked based on partially on those kinds of records, but also on POW records that we've got from American sailors who became prisoners of war of the British during the War of 1812. A researcher in the mid-1900s collected all these records, and then sort of based on descriptions that the imprisoners put down of, prisoner descriptions, was able to sort of extrapolate out a percentage of the population that was probably had African American or or other ethnicities and backgrounds besides like sort of British, white Western European. And so based on those numbers, we've tended to guesstimate that the total number of Black sailors on board Constitution was, at the time of the War of 1812, was probably around 10% or so. But again, what roles did they have? In some cases, it was They were not officers or Marines, but some of them were, ordinary seamen and may have become able-bodied seamen. We recently, we find out about African American sailors on board from other sources. A professor at Johns Hopkins University was doing research on Black citizens in Baltimore who had become activists before the Civil War. And it turns out one of the real prominent ones, George Hackett, had been a sailor on Constitution during the Pacific Squadron. And this professor, Martha Jones, was arguing that one of the things that made Hackett a successful activist was that he had learned how to defend his citizenship rights and make use of the justice system for himself in Baltimore as a result of his experiences seeing that in the Navy on Constitution. But his role on Constitution was as a servant to the Commodore. So he wasn't exactly in a high up position, but interestingly, he was in a low position in a very powerful place in the Commodore's cabin, where he was able to see this power being wielded and learn how the system worked. So, those are the kind of fascinating stories that still continue to pop up now and then.
Yeah, I've been working on a book about the world cruise, and I have the payroll, which doesn't identify anyone by race, and also the ship's log, which also doesn't identify anyone by race, but other sources like Seaman's papers, or then just finding a name and then doing a genealogical search. I have turned up a number of African Americans on the crew. Yeah, and some are, as Carl said, stewards, but others are sailors. And in fact, there's at least one who's a foretopman, which is a guy who would be up in the foretop and doing the same things that white sailors would do and paid the same as white sailors would do. But I have to say, very few of the ordinary sailors would ever become officers too. Yeah. But then, we do have to think about people like George Hackett or David Tobias or others whose stories we know, and they're treated differently, definitely on land, and quite like possibly treated differently at sea. So it's a fascinating stories about these people, and it really is the people who make the ship. And yeah,
there is a rich historiography, a historical background of study into African American sailors, and prior to that, Black Africans who were on board ships and vessels, because of the fact that the sort of inherent meritocracy of the sea, right? Like, it doesn't matter who you are once you're out in the middle of a storm at sea, everybody has to pull their weight. And the fact that your skills matter more than the social construct of how you might be perceived on land made it a place of opportunity for people who would not have had those opportunities on land, and particularly in the merchant marine, and in the whaling and fishing fleets, they had those opportunities to earn money, come back, and create better lives for themselves on shore as a result.
That's right, and a big shout out to the Navy, or at least a military career at sea. Just like you said, Carl, when you're out in the middle of the ocean and you're in a raging storm, there's really no time for kind of divisions or divisiveness. You have to basically survive. So there's more of a brother at arms type thing when you're out on the water. So I could see the Navy and even the Merchant Marines being at the forefront of integration. So, that's just kind of historically, why I think the Navy, in terms of our one of the military organizations, the Navy holds on to a better tradition just going forward, and just Constitution's a part of that. So,
now, what made you join the Navy, if I may?
The uniforms. No, my whole family is our Army. My uncles all went to the Army. They all served in Vietnam, and I guess I've always kind of been maybe a mini black sheep of the family, but just
you're the rebel.
Navy, yeah, just the Navy, just the traditions, the just the style and maybe just the fact that, you could kind of see the world, that whole like kind of being more worldly and international, and just you could really stop anywhere when you're on a ship, and just that chance of seeing the rest of the world. So that's why the Navy just appealed to me.
I have put a link to the Facebook post from the Boston Vets that features you wearing your current uniform.
Yeah.
And it is striking. Yes, Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was actually just curious because you said you were coming up on 3 years on the USS Constitution, and I mean, I'm sure there's plenty, but is there any stories that you have yourself or of the ship that you found most intriguing or significant?
Yes, actually. So kind of a sea story, might not be oh so funny, but it's really about these covers. We never used to wear these covers. In fact, Carl, I'm pretty sure you can remember, we used to wear these really hard plastic, kind of like, they were almost like dipped in plastic covers, and they were really hard and straight across, and they had a ribbon tied on them. And at about my 7 to 8 month mark being here, I remember we went through a complete uniform change. We changed our pants, the way we wear everything, and then we got new covers. And the covers really weren't, the crew really didn't like them, because the old covers you could really slap on and take off, and it was very interchangeable. These have to be kind of fitted to your head. So when the new sailors got their covers on, it was like super difficult to wear. A lot of them were squeezing their heads, and it was just kind of miserable. But the underway in our first underway in 2000, I want to say 2019, which was in May, I remember on that underway, it really rained on us during the underway. And as it was raining on everybody, since we're out in the middle of the water, we can't change or like get into our rain gear. We're all getting wet, and our covers are getting soaked. And we're all wondering, like, what is that smell? And we're all wondering, like, what's smelling on board? And sure enough, all of the rain had soaked the covers and like made them stink. And then we couldn't even go around the guests, and we actually had to take our covers off. But lo and behold, when the covers got wet, they started to like form, and suddenly all the covers started fitting properly. So it was just kind of like this enlightening moment. We all kind of laughed, but it was like a stinky resolution to getting the covers to fit right. So that's something I'll never, ever forget. But another thing, obviously, is just every single time the Constitution goes underway out into the water, it's just an amazing feat. And I've gotten to meet all sorts of great people, World War II vets, Secretary of the Navy, Mick Pond, which is Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. I've met the governor, all sorts of people. So just meeting the people is really what's memorable. But I will never forget that time the covers really stank up the ship. So
I'll fill out a little background on those replacement covers. One of the challenges for USS Constitution is that as a ship that's been around for 200 plus years, the ship itself has constantly been altered over the eras. And the Navy's goal right now is to return the ship to what it would have looked like in 1812, which is a sort of slow halting process, but it's based on ongoing research and trying to figure out. And Margarita Deasy, the historian that Charles keeps referring to, is the ship's historian. I work for the museum. Margarita works for the Navy itself. And her job is to oversee the constant changes that are being done to the ship, record them and monitor, whether the Navy's meeting its goals of bringing the ship and its presentation back. The covers, the hats, covers, Navy slang for the hat.
Hats, yeah.
These new ones were actually manufactured by my predecessor at the museum, a fellow by the name of Matt Brankel. And Matt's specialty was historical clothing. And when he left the museum, it was because he'd had a child and wanted to work from home. And so while he was caring for his kid at home, he got into the hat making business. And he had been doing it, but now he is Matt Brankel, a hatter. You can find him online, and all he does is specialize in these historically accurate, fitted period hats for reenactors, museums, movie studios, etc. And the smell and everything that Charles is referring to is the fact that the felt that the hats are made out of will shrink when wet. But the materials in it, as it gives off the first couple times, will be kind of raw. But it also does have a little bit of a weatherproofness to it too, that will kind of adhere to it as you go along. They're far more historically accurate, and Matt is now also consulting with the Navy on the contract to continue refining these historical uniforms that the crew wears to ensure that they are historically accurate.
Accurate, yep.
I just think that's the coolest job in the world. You know, what are you doing? I'm in my house making 1800s hats.
So any other, what's been the most interesting question you've gotten from a visitor to the ship?
Oh man, there's so many. A lot of the times, it's funny, people love seeing the ship, but they're always curious about us, the sailors. So a lot of their questions are, where have you been? Where do you want to go? And what's it like? So those are the more common questions, but a lot of the times people really want to know about battle. They want to know about sometimes even the gruesomeness of battle. And we always do, before COVID-19, we used to always get with the museum, and the museum would always help us kind of cater our tours and refine what we're saying and how we say it. And, I remember sometimes they used to always say, kind of be careful about, talking about gruesome battle, gruesome war, because you really never know who's in your audience. But most of the time, people want to know about the guns and what was it like? This is a warship, tell war stories. That's what people want to know. But the records show, I'm pretty sure Carl will attest, is, battle on board the ship was pretty gruesome sometimes. Some of the things that you would see, and it's hard to describe, but we try to hold that off for more smaller tours where we can kind of make sure we check our audience. But most of the time, people want to know about the gruesomeness of battle. That's what people ask for.
Had you ever been aboard the ship before you came to serve on the ship?
No, surprisingly. I did know where Constitution was. It's a shame you can ask a lot of sailors in service right now, do you know about USS Constitution? And they're just like, So it's a shame, but I think what we're doing now, Constitution, kind of blasting on Facebook now that COVID-19 has helped us virtually. I think more sailors and more people are going to learn about Constitution. So no, I had never been aboard her before, but I did know she was in Boston, and I was excited to be here.
The previous commander, Nathaniel Schick, said that one of his missions was that every sailor who serves on Constitution goes back out into the fleet and carries the stories with them. But Commander Schick departed Constitution for his next command right before COVID hit, and right. I think he'd be amazed at sort of how things have transcribed. Charles, briefly, like compared to live visitation before COVID, how many people do you think Constitution's reaching out to and the Navy's reaching out to now?
Now it's hard to say. I mean, mind you, we can look at the views and we can smash together all the videos and count the people. But I remember when Constitution at the height in 2019, we saw, I want to say, well over maybe 600,000 people in just a year. So that's easy to kind of count and manage. Plus, we were also doing things online as well. So it's really hard to get back to that. I really do wish we can get back to kind of interacting with people, because I really do think that that's how the stories are passed on the best way, that kind of word of mouth, really talking about your experiences and your excitement into the next person. But now we're able to reach further in terms of what the internet is capable of doing. We can speak to people in South Africa, Australia, Asia, things like that. So, not just being here is a way to get Constitution. That's what I think COVID-19 has helped us do, is take Constitution further out into the world. But I really do want people to come back, because that's how I think that's how we can best pass the message.
Now, I know you won't be here, but are there plans to do turnarounds this summer? Do you know?
We're trying. I know that COVID-19, the interesting thing about it is, we could host something here on the ship that is, we could social distance and things like that. But the true challenge is once we get underway, most of the time people want to see the ship, and it may encourage people to get together and not adhere to some of the social distancing guidelines. So it's our hope that we can get the ship underway. I know the CO, Mr. John Benda, he's chomping at the bit to get the ship underway. But I know that he's up against, making sure that he's doing the right thing in accordance with the state and the Navy and things like that. So there are plans, just stand by to see if they come to fruition.
Is there anything you'd like to show us, since here you are on the ship and imagining that we were with you? Any particular thing on the ship you wanted to point out to the class?
Yeah, so as I stand here, like you alluded to, Mr. Allison, we're right in front of the captain's cabin. The best thing I like to do, and something that the CO really admires too, is just to talk about some of the prior commanding officers as they apply to USS Constitution history. So this is our board here, and it talks about all the COs that were that had served aboard USS Constitution. Even today, our current CO, Mr. John A. Benda, commander, took over in 2020 in February. So a lot of the times I'm always asking myself, what is there to learn? What can we find out from this timeline? Because this is really a good and active timeline. Unless you go to the USS Constitution Museum, where they have a beautiful timeline that really runs through Constitution's history from start to finish, or not to finish, but to now. This is really the only thing on the ship, as well as the first lieutenant board. But this is really the only thing on the ship that really talks about the timeline. And the interesting thing I'd like to point out is right after Constitution comes back from what's called her national cruise, where she does a 3-coast tour, East Coast, West Coast, and the Gulf Coast, to kind of raise American spirits through the Great Depression, and just to kind of say thank you for the restoration we did some years before. After the national cruise and a little bit of kind of loitering time here in 1939 to 1941, the commanders change interestingly. So we go from captain, high-ranking officials, to then suddenly changing in 1941. And 1941 is about right when World War II breaks out. So I could see some of the higher ranking officers going overseas, serving in the fleet, and not really kind of serving aboard Constitution, which now at this point is not necessarily, unusable, but really not a wartime asset. So from 1941, we look at some of the kind of lower ranking people take over Constitution, still officers, but not as high as a commander or even a captain. And this happens all the way down until 1969, which is the wrap up from the Vietnam War. So this kind of time period where there's a significant change in the rank of all the commanders of USS Constitution, this is kind of the wartime of the United States. So you have World War II working into Korea, working right into Vietnam, and then we're back here in the 1970s. And then from there on, you have commanders all the way throughout. So it's just interesting. I look at that and I'm just like, why is it that way? And it's just, you kind of have to, look at the timelines and try to imagine what's going on in the world. And that's another thing I like to tell people is that Constitution, yes, the ship has its history, but Constitution belongs to United States and world history too. So I even tell my junior sailors to make connections, make links, find the way to plug Constitution into the world's history or US history. And this is just one of those interesting things that I had noticed some time ago about this long time block between 1941 and 1970. And I'm just like, wow, I never even thought of it that way. So that's something interesting that I have found.
That is interesting. I really like the way you plug that into what else is happening. Mike, you have another question?
Yeah, I was actually curious. I might have missed this, but what was the lowest rank that kind of served as acting commander, I guess, of the USS Constitution during that wartime?
Yep. So there's a few times this happens. Sailing master here in the 1800s, and there's also chief bosun here in the 1940s and 50s. And I know Carl will be able to talk about that a little bit more in depth, but most of the time, sometimes when Constitution's in transition, or there needs to be kind of a holding period, they'll put certain people in charge, whether or not, you have something like the Barbary Wars going on here at this time, or once again, we're inside the Korean War. Constitution's really kind of making a shift in time, and maybe there's no commissioned officer that could take over. So you have a sailing master here who was pretty high ranking in the enlisted ranks, almost kind of a professional in his right. And then you have the chief boatswain, also once again a high ranking enlisted sailor that could just basically kind of caretake or watch the ship at the time. So that's really the lowest ranking. Everyone else is a commissioned officer.
Thank you.
Yep.
Interesting. Do you have a favorite among the commanders from the past?
Well, Mr. Benda, if you're watching, you're always my favorite.
No.
But to be honest with you, Mr. Allison, one of my favorites is Charles Stewart. Charles Stewart, captain of Constitution during the Battle of Sion and Levant, he usually never gets the recognition that he deserves most of the time when it comes to learning some of the history of Constitution internal to the Constitution crew. I know that he's an amazing figure outside of the composition of the crew, mainly because he's one of the longest serving, sailing, officers in the U.S. Navy. I'm actually reading his book called A Call to Sea, and just kind of learning more about his history. But I think just defeating 2 ships at once, pulling into Marblehead, avoiding capture, and kind of just being that ultra sailor that he is, Charles Stewart, he's the man.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
After
the
John Benda.
the downtimes that Charles is talking about is, we sort of commonly call it today like being mothballed, right? Like, being put on the back burner or like put aside and kept in holding until needed. But at the time it was referred to as being in ordinary, and when you were in ordinary, you were at the dock just waiting, and with nothing actively, going on, then things like a bosun who was, more skilled at maintenance of the rig and repair work on the rig made total sense as someone to sort of be in charge.
Yeah.
And just thinking then about, we began talking about the cutting of the trees and all, and the moments of battle are relatively rare in the ship's, 200 plus year history, but you have lots of other, and so the ship needs constant maintenance, and that is really still an important part of your role, is to make sure it's not leaking too much.
Yeah, definitely.
Does the ship still take on water? Is it?
Yes, it does actually. So wood is, or at least the type of wood that we use, is really good at kind of keeping it at bay, but it is still slightly porous. So sometimes, or every day, water does creep in. And we have automatic electric pumps on board that remove the water quite naturally. So when the ship was first put into the water in July of 2017, to my understanding, I hadn't checked on board yet, but to my understanding, there was, the wood is kind of constricted, and it hadn't swelled and kind of taken on the water and expanded. So the ship was taking on a lot of water. So there was, a lot of the times the watchstanders that are on board, they used to have to go down into the bilge and manually pump that stuff out with, an electrical pump that we had at the time. So a lot of water in the early goes when she comes back into the water, but ever since that time, kind of 2019, 2020, the water has really slowed down in terms of how much water comes on board. So today it's very insignificant. So
It's like another natural process, like the water on the hats, and it causes a change in the material.
That's right.
Sitting at the dock kind of helps with that too. One of the things that sailors would experience underway, and still do on wooden sailing ships, is that as the vessel is moving through the water, the pieces are flexing, and as they're flexing, you have this tendency to do what's seen as working the ship, and as it works its way, you end up opening more. And so the rougher the seas you've got, the more likely it is that you're going to be pumping more out of the bilge. And it's not because water's coming over the top and getting in. It's that all those pieces and parts that connect together are flexing with the waves and letting in more water.
That's right.
Are there other questions for Mr. Hardmon? We don't want to keep you all day. We know you have a real job to get back to. And I should say, Margarita and I have been emailing this week trying to find a time when she can come and talk to the class too. So, so are there other questions for our guest before we let him go? I should say, just thinking about your uniform, a few years ago, we offered this class in conjunction with the sail training that the museum does. And I think it was fun. We had a few Suffolk students and then the rest were sailors. I think the most notable thing that happened is one of our students wound up marrying one of the sailors. So,
Nice.
I think it is
All
the
right.
uniform.
Yeah, it is. It's a navy. The dress blues, in my opinion, is just like, that is like true testament to being a sailor. Cracker Jack box, stuff like that.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been fun. I've learned a lot, and I know the class has, and really appreciate you joining us. So, any other questions before we let him off the hook? Okay, well, thank you. This has been fun, and thank you again for your service, and hope to see you before May. If not, I look forward to seeing you at some point when you're back in the fleet. So.
Appreciate it, Mr. Allison. Thank you again, and thank you to your son for giving me that post. Big shout out to USS Constitution Museum, Carl, and everybody over there that keeps on doing great stuff. Hopefully, Miss Margarita can get on with you, because true professional of the ship.
She is. Yeah.
Super smart, and we really missed her here. But thank you again, Constitution crew. Thanks you, and hopefully you guys have a great day, and we'll see you in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Stay
Thank
warm.
you
No
very
problem.
much. Thank you.
No problem. See you guys.
Okay, so that was fun. Why don't we do this? We're going to have a debate on the War of 1812. And has anyone chosen a side, or should Carl and I assign sides to this? How about a show of hands? Who is in favor of the War of 1812 now that you've done the reading? No one is. Wow. This makes it good. We can just, wow. Okay, so why don't we have, let's see, Riley, Sarah, Mike, and Mike Ford will, I better write this down. Let's see, we have.
Actually, could I potentially be for it? Maybe?
You could be. Okay, so on the for side, we will have, let's see, Mike DeAngelis and Ray Levin and Megan. And on the against, we'll have Riley, Sarah, Mike Ford, and Trevor. Against. And why don't we take a short break? I can put you guys in groups if you'd like, and you can spend some time conferring. And so we will take a short break, and let me just create these two groups. Oops.
You mean you set them into breakout rooms? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Okay.
And Trevor, and let's see. Okay, so we have one more person in the for the war against, I'm sorry, more or against than for, which seems to be the way the room works. Okay, so you're all invited to join rooms. We'll take a short break while you're conferring, and then we'll come back and figure out, Carl and I will get to vote then. I guess everyone will vote. Maybe you'll convince the rest of the class one way or the other. Okay?
Awesome. How much time do you want to take?
Why don't we take about 15 minutes, a break of 15 minutes, and then we'll break of 10 minutes, and then about 15 minutes for them to prepare what they're going to say.
So do you want to reconvene at 11:30 maybe?
At 11:30, yes. Okay, great.
Bob, have you gone into any of the breakout rooms? You're muted. Still muted.
Yes, I have.
Oh, okay.
And the pro-war people seem to be really working hard and talking. The others were, the anti-war people were heavily researching. So I don't know if they had done much of the reading before. So
It's kind of interesting considering that everybody said they were anti-war.
I know, yeah. Maybe it's just a reflexive thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so we'll see.
I've been meaning to call Margarita. I haven't talked to her in an age and a day. What'd she have to say?
Well, her one of the issues, of course, is Friday is a day she works, so she has to justify taking time away from doing what she's doing to do this. So we've been going back and forth, sending her the syllabus, telling her what she'll do and all. So, but yeah, other than that, she's, I guess, doing okay. Just being remote is a problem, and I think she does come in on Fridays. And
yeah, she's been just doing that one day in the office a week and then kind of working remotely from home and mostly spending the time organizing files. Kate and I, she reaches out to Kate and I when she finds like, some new nugget in the morass of vertical folders that she has.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, she really is a terrific person, and just it would be great to have her come because I have had her speak to classes before, and she's just captivating. And I think really
she's a great presenter, and I honestly, like, nobody knows the minutia of the ship better than her.
Yeah.
You're still on a virtual backdrop, right? That's not actually behind you, is it?
No, that is a yeah. Yeah, well, the museum's been closed. I've been going in and helping myself to things.
Nice. Yeah. I was actually in there for all day yesterday. I was in there all day yesterday.
Oh, wow.
Trying to record some new videos.
Oh, good. How does it look going back in?
Well, everything's just closed down. I mean, nothing's happened, Yeah. We've been on, even in curatorial, we've sort of been in a holding pattern on a number of projects and stuff. Because, Kate and I were able to be brought back a while back, mostly thanks to grant funding for outreach projects.
Mm-hmm.
But Hari was still on furlough and continued to be until he finally decided that, he was concerned about coming back. He didn't want to come back in sort of the facilities and exhibits role.
Right.
And there wasn't really funding for him to come back as collections head, but he also didn't want to be back in exposing himself, in the museum.
Mm-hmm.
And he had plans to retire anyway that he had been waffling back and forth on last fall. So he finally said, okay, come March, I won't be coming back. I'll just consider it officially a transfer from furlough to retirement.
Oh, wow.
Which is really a bummer especially for Kate and I, because he has such, Hari has such an immense institutional, knowledge of 20 years worth of the collection. So, so we're going to be scrambling to kind of catch up a little bit there.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, at least Margarita is close by, but and Hari's a good guy.
Yeah. Well, it was like internal projects, that inventories and where stuff was and what we were doing with specific loans of items and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's much more that than kind of any knowledge of stuff.
Yeah.
How are the rest of your classes going?
They seem to be going well. I have one freshman class that's all honors, and these are students who are really motivated, and the other one is just regular freshmen, and that have some really good students in it, and others who are, less so. So it's been, but I think they're all doing, those both meet in person, and still there are a number of students, they got sick, so they're doing it online, and so it's interesting. It's interesting actually being in the class, but everyone wearing a mask.
Yeah.
And it really, they can't, they have to maintain a distance. So it's
Right. And is that like a lecture hall class too? I mean, how many students are you talking about?
Well, the classes at Suffolk, the classrooms at Suffolk tend to be small, but that of course has put a big wrinkle in it, because if it's a classroom that was designed to hold 30, it can only have 15 in it now.
Wow.
So it has forced us to actually shrink the size of the classes. But on the other hand, the college's business model isn't to have classes that small. Something the dean is always pointing out to us. Yeah, so it's really an interesting moment. And I'm doing these two classes at the Harvard Extension School that are all online. One is on the early American Republic, and the other is actually on New England literature. And
Wow.
a history of New England literature. And most of the students in it are really highly motivated people who are more interested in literature than history, which is fine. But also you attract a certain kind of student to these.
Is it a history class or an English class?
It is a history class.
Okay.
It's called the History of New England Literature, or something, New England Literature through History, or something like that. But every week, this next week is the last week it meets, and every week we've been a different period. And so this week we were doing, well, The Last Hurrah and Now Voyager, and then next week, the last week, we're reading a couple of recent plays,
Wow.
Good People and The Luck of the Irish. But we started with the Puritans and made our way through every week doing a different period. So it's been kind of fun.
I imagine.
And yeah,
Right.
so it's I'm enjoying it. In the one of the Boston classes I'm doing, or one of the freshman classes I'm doing, is on Boston, and their assignment is to profile an eminent Bostonian using, and so I was able to contact a number of the eminent Bostonians I know and ask if they want to do this, and then the students had to do research and all, and some of them, it's been impressive, but some of them have found out, and then after they've gotten to a certain point where they have done the background research, I put them in touch with the person, and then they do an interview, and they're supposed to do a video of this. So that's been, we'll see how that goes. And, it's an interesting list of Dusty Rhodes. I don't know if you know her from Conventures.
Sure.
I think she does The Tall Ships, and Larry DeCara, a longtime political person, Henry Lee, who was really the president of the Friends of the Public Garden, and Vivian Lee. Let's see, John Drew, the developer of the Seaport, Billy Evans, the former police commissioner, and Byron Rushing and his wife, Frida Garcia. He was a state legislator.
Wow.
And she was a South End community activist. So it gives them a range of people. And the real thing is finding out how the city works.
Yeah.
Each of these people in a different way was involved in some part of Boston's civic life. So that'll be fun, interesting to see what they are able to do.
It's kind of fascinating.
It is, yeah. I didn't realize that before Dusty Rhodes came to Boston, she actually managed teams in the World Football League. I don't know if you remember that in the 70s, this breakaway football league. And she was the first woman to
I remember the league. Yeah, I didn't know she had been involved.
No, yeah. But she is such a phenomenon, just really good.
Yeah.
I love having the students see, really a high-powered person like this who just gets things done.
Yeah.
Oh, here's Megan.
All right, here we go.
Yes,
One back.
As I said, Carl, the pro-war people really are They are anxious to get this.
They're on it, huh?
Yeah,
Ready to go fight.
yeah. Let me call back the others.
Drag those pacifists back here kicking and screaming.
Okay. So, should we go to war against Great Britain? What do you think? Who's going to get us started? I think the pro people should probably start. So Michael, Ray, Megan. Michael, you're muted.
Sorry about that. That's the second time I've done that. So I would say to start, one thing I would want to bring up is the Chesapeake Leopard crisis from the spring of 1807, when a British ship fired upon an American ship and killed some of its crew while looking for deserters of the Royal Navy. I think that alone, because it was right off Hampton Roads. I think that is an act of war right there, so close to home. I don't think we can sit back and allow something like this to happen, continuously keep happening.
Anyone else? Anyone want to counter that? Pointing out that was 5 years ago. Yes, Trevor.
That was exactly my point. If it were, in fact, an act of war, then where is the war around us? It's been 5 years. You've mentioned one isolated incident, which was a tragedy, I'll give you that. But we have not been attacked further by the British. And
are you sure about that?
Please enlighten me. Maybe I've missed a news article or two.
Are you aware of just last year in 1811 off the coast of New York when a British ship impressed one of our ships? Are you aware of that? I mean, that's just off the coast of New York. How many times are we going to let them push the line and keep seizing our ships so close to home before we consider it an act of war rather than just an act of violence?
The fact remains, you can count the number of incidents of aggression on your fingers. You cannot count the amount of lives that will be lost with a conflict of an empire in a conflict with an empire the size of Great Britain. You cannot count the number of American lives lost in a conflict like that on your hands. You will be losing thousands of good men to a cause that is just not worth fighting at the moment.
I shall counter that. You say lives will be lost, yet lives are already being affected, might I add. The British are seizing our ships, which threatens our economy. But when those ships are seized, the crews are seized. They languish in jail cells. They're forced to work for the British, which is basically enslavement. You say lives will be lost, but lives are already being affected. Innocent men who've done nothing wrong but go to the sea to make a living for their family, and they get captured. Are we going to stand for that? For men being captured, seized away from their nation and their people, and let them continue with that? Are we? Is my question.
I do weep for those men who have been lost.
1,800 ships already have been taken.
But if we were to send men to war after just opening our first military academy in this country 10 years ago, how can we hope to put up any sort of fight against an army with the prestige of Great Britain. You may say we did it 20 years ago, but that was men fighting for their basic right to their freedoms. When we go searching for war, we cannot expect men to fight with the same vigor. And I will point out that we've lost President Washington. He's long since retired from his service in the military. I don't know if we can trust our men to go into a fight where they're severely outnumbered, outgunned, and out tacticianed.
You'd be surprised at the vigor with which men will fight to defend their countrymen. And also, just because we haven't got General Washington anymore doesn't mean we don't have many capable tacticians. The success of an army is not dependent upon one single man.
However, it is dependent on a strong navy, and currently we have 7 frigates, we have 4 schooners, 4 ketches, and only 170 gunboats, going up against one of the largest naval forces in the world. I think it's safe to say that the lives that would be lost going into that war would far outnumber the lives that are already lost.
Do not look on this as an act of cowardice. Look at this as an act of intelligence.
How can you justify the Native American violence out west then? Because I'm not sure if you're informed, but the British have been arming the Native Americans and inciting violence. So how can you actively justify not showing some force in this situation? They're basically inciting violence I guess I won't call it an act of war, but I will call it an act of violence through a third party without actually doing it themselves.
Also, you say we're going searching for whether this is an offensive war. Is it really an offensive war if they are arming Native Americans in the South, spilling American soil on our territorial jurisdiction? They're seizing our ships, up to 1,800 already, stealing our men, forcing them to basically work as slaves. They're getting as close as off the shores of New York. Is it really an offensive war? It's a defensive war. Our options are defend or submit. Are we going to submit?
Well, I will admit it is not the act of an ally to arm our enemies. I will say that it is not the act of an enemy. Were the Romans at war with the many countries of Asia when they dealt arms on the Silk Road? I do not think that our quarrel here is with Britain, but rather the Indians that we wish to remove.
Can you please repeat that? I've had audio lag.
Basically, the sum of my point was that if you really want to talk about the natives in the West, then let's talk about fighting the natives in the West. But let's not go picking a fight with a superpower across the globe.
But the way you speak of it, we're treating a symptom. We are not treating the main problem. Because if you want to talk about native violence, you've got to talk about why that violence is happening and why they were incited by the British. So the two are linked. And if you want to talk about one, you've got to address the other. You can't have
one is far more manageable than the other at this point, though.
Yes, but who's to say that even if we fight the natives now, that the British will not incite them again, and we will have to fight them again and lose more lives. So if we address the problem of the British rather than just the natives, we won't have to deal with the native problem anymore. At least it's easier to deal with.
As soon as the natives are armed with a fleet of ships that can bombard our coastlines, then I will be happy to stop the source of that. But as it stands...
And where are the natives going to get a fleet of ships other than from the British?
Well, that's my point. I don't think they are.
So Trevor, then you would support a war against the British because they do have a fleet of ships that is attacking the American coast.
Not in a consistent manner like it would be as a threat of Native Americans, say if they were to raise a fleet along the Mississippi River.
I would like to bring our attention to a quote from our president, James Madison. Our colleague, Mr. Calhoun, has kindly referred us the message of James Madison. And I would like to take a brief moment to talk about this quote, just a brief segment of it. Basically where he says that after the experience which the United States have had of the great injustice of the British government towards them, exemplified by so many acts of violence and oppression, it will be more difficult to justify to the impartial world their patient forbearance than the measures to which it has become necessary to resort to avenge the wrongs and vindicate the rights and honor of the nation. Your committee are happy to observe on a dispassionate view of the conduct of the United States that they see in no cause of censure. If a long forbearance under injuries ought ever to be considered a virtue in any nation, it is one which peculiarly becomes the United States. No people ever had stronger motives to cherish peace. None have ever cherished it with greater sincerity and zeal. But the period has now arrived when the United States must support their character and station among the nations of the earth, or submit to the most shameful degradation. I bring up that quote because I will sit here and I will ask you, do you believe that the profits that we've been making, which I must say, our profits have been flourishing even though our 1,800 ships have been captured? Do you believe that those profits are worth more than our ships being captured and the lives being captured?
I'll counter your quote with a quote of my own from not a countryman, but you could consider him one of the fathers of our country. This is a quote from Adam Smith. Sorry, I don't actually have. My point here is, if we're going to run a fledgling country on the philosophies of Paine and Smith, then we cannot run around like school children being picked on like a bully, trying to get into any conflicts that we can somewhat justify. At this point, it makes no financial sense to go to war with a country like Britain. Our own Secretary of the Treasury has predicted that this war would cost $36 million when our expected revenue is only $17 million. Your proposal here would be to tax a people that the majority of are content with being farmers and living off this new land that we have barely even started to cultivate. Our responsibilities as a nation now should be supporting the people that that look for upward mobility. We cannot raise taxes, go to this war, expend lives and dollars, and expect these people to remain content. If we run up a debt like this, then we are imposing financial death on these people. The counter to this would be to take out loans, but even that would be a chore in itself, because this body voted to disband the National Bank just a year ago. How do we expect to pay for this? Please, I'm curious.
Well, I would like to draw my point that I made before about the 1,800 ships that have already been captured up until 1810 between the British, the French, and their allies. I mean, we're making plenty of money from profits on our merchant ships. I don't see why we wouldn't have more than enough money. But I counter your point and ask you the question. So you, in this situation, decide that you will submit to Britain, considering that just a year ago, again, as I talked about in the beginning, Britain is now off the coast of New York, seizing ships. I mean, how far are we going to allow them to go before we just sit back and let them stroll into our ports and do as they please? And I don't know, maybe we'll have another Boston Tea Party on our hands.
Well, I guess we could argue that that hasn't happened yet. I think our army is, our military is too small right now, that I fear for the people of this country. They're going to have to pull in the state militias. That's not fair to our people. They don't want to leave. I mean, we've had governors from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts who they don't want to comply with this request. They don't want to send in their troops. They don't want to take them away from their families. And unless this invasion is happening or it's clearly imminent, I don't think that it calls for us to be declaring this war. Have we not tried negotiation? Have we not tried diplomacy?
And if I may go from that point, the people that are being taken are maritime sailors. That is the main source of those workers is the New England states. How can we expect a whole country to fight for their countrymen when statesmen won't even fight for their statesmen?
I'm wondering, Trevor, if that very eloquently put comment, we country, they're not, statesmen aren't going to fight for their statesmen. If the New England sailors are the ones being impressed, why then, as Sarah said, do New England's governors not want to be part of the war effort? I mean, it seems like a contradictory thing. Maybe.
Well, that's
maybe
what I'm saying. If people from Massachusetts won't fight for people from Massachusetts, then how can we expect the will of the entire country to be any different than that?
Do any of the Megan or Michael or Ray have an answer to that? I mean, they've been hammering at the unpreparedness, but it seems like there is a bigger problem, a lack of any national will here to get involved in this.
We won the revolution through spirit alone. We are not going to win this war if we do not have any spirit.
Well, spirit and the help of France, but that's
a different story entirely.
I think we could also move this conversation over to the aggressiveness of the war hawks and these allegations about President Madison's involvement in the John Henry scandal and how that might be impacting his decision to want to go into war. It was discovered that Madison has paid a British spy $50,000 for information about the Federalists. And I think that maybe there's a little bit of, I don't want to say it out loud, but corruption going on here. This doesn't seem like the people's war at all. This seems like President Madison's war. And as I said before, the war hawks' inability to negotiate and deploy diplomacy.
So you're saying the war really is meant to bolster the Republicans and Mr. Madison as opposed against the Federalists. So it's a political war being whipped up by, I don't want to point at Ray, Michael, and Megan as saying they're the war hawks. Any response to this?
Well, I think my colleague is being a little unfair to President Madison. I will say that in regard to Federalist Paper 47, he did make some great points, and we should look to those maybe more than his more recent arguments. I think that he was really onto something when he said that the federal government should expect state governments to rise up and call us out if we impose our will too much. And I think that we really have a clear example of that.
Any response to the anti-war crowd here?
I'm curious what your suggestion would be. I mean, you're throwing around a lot of hypotheticals to not go to war, but I'm curious what your solution is for what we're dealing with now. Because it seems as though you are going down the path of exactly what I said, submitting, which, I mean, if that is your course, then so be it. But I'm curious to know what your actual solution is to this problem if war is not it.
Yeah, and just to add to what he was saying, like our two options are defend or submit. If you're going to submit and you're saying, well, oh, they haven't done anything that's bad enough to declare war about yet, so we wait until they're on our shores. Like you're saying, oh, like our men are sleeping peacefully for now, like they're not on our shores yet. We wait until they're here, like they're already on New York. They're already arming people in the Southwest. Like, where do we draw the line as far as how long we're planning on submitting? Do we just keep letting them like harass our shorelines, harass literally our people on our soil? Like, do we not defend that at all? Do we not defend the people that are being enslaved at sea by British men? Like, are we just going to let it happen? At what point do you draw the line?
And there was one point that Sarah brought up about negotiating with Great Britain. I would like to draw your attention to Jay's Treaty back in the late 1700s, where we had a treaty with Great Britain, and they still continued to seize our ships. So even when there was some sort of peace, some sort of agreement between us and them, it didn't stop.
I think one constant when in discussions with warmongers such as yourselves is that the enemy will always be nuanced. So you say that there are two options, defend or submit, but there are a world of other options. We have a country here that has seemingly limitless potential for economic growth, in which we can become a major superpower through that, not through military means. And we can continue to grow our Navy without throwing our much smaller force up against a giant army. We can grow this army, and if these problems persist, we will actually be prepared. We do not need to go to war in 1812. We can fortify this country without being aggressors.
Can I ask you both about the situation of Britain being at war with France, and France essentially occupying all of Europe, and in fact at this moment is in the process of invading Russia? I mean, how do you see this war against Britain fitting in with this bigger war happening in Europe? A potential war, I should say, since we haven't declared it yet.
Well, I think it could potentially put us, I mean, if we were to go to war with Britain while they're at war with France, that would put us in a positive position. Because I remember, well, there was, so our ships were basically like our Atlantic trade was flourishing during the time when France was blocking Britain. So when they were blocking Britain, our ships were able to freely trade. Our ships weren't being seized. So I think in a sense, if we were to get involved in the war with Britain and France was on our side, I think that would help us significantly.
Now who's dealing with hypotheticals?
I mean, you still haven't provided any options outside of just submitting. You said that there's hypotheticals of our economy flourishing, but I recall a time when there was an embargo and our ships were not sailing across the seas to hopefully hurt Britain in seizing our ships, and yet all it did was hurt ourselves.
I don't want to interject, but I would just tell Trevor, Sarah, and Mike that the embargo was the idea of these guys now who are saying we need to go to war. So that would be a good thing to say, well, that was your idea. And that might be unfair. So, but anyway, good point, Mike. Michael, you raised a good point there. I think if you actually were proposing the war in 1812, the other side would have, you probably wouldn't have wanted to say too much about the embargo because it didn't really work and it was your idea.
I think it, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to talk about how, is it possible that we're being played as a pawn for Napoleon? I mean, we could talk about his involvement in the Non-Intercourse Act in 1810, where he said that, you know, he would if they normalized trade, they would employ that against the other power, which they did. And so Napoleon jumped on that, but he never kept any of his promises that he made. So why are we going to support him in this war against the British? Why, like, that doesn't seem very cohesive to me.
I will also say, in regard to Napoleon, while he expands his empire east, why are we not focused on expanding west? We could have the entirety of this continent to ourselves like he wishes to over there. The way to assert yourself as a superpower in this world is to grow, not to fight.
Any answer to that?
I don't know. I feel like we aren't joining like Napoleon's cause here. Like, we have our own reason to have a fight with the British here. They've been messing with us completely outside of that. And while Britain is a very powerful global superpower, they have a very impressive navy, very impressive army. Is this not a good time then to be, you know, not like we're not picking a fight with them. They picked a fight with us with the actions and, you know, the offenses that they've made against us. But would this not be a good time then to declare war against them, as opposed to when they're at their most, like their strongest point? Like, they're trying to deal with Napoleon right now. Are they really going to put they're not going to have their best foot to put forward against us? Like, it's not like we're joining Napoleon. We're defending the honor of our own nation. We're defending the lives of our own men.
But in the greater sense of it, we are. If we join into this war, the British are gonna take their resources and point them at us. And Napoleon has, meanwhile, he's got this whole continent that is not getting the total force of the British army anymore because they're coming to us. So by doing that, we're allowing more countries and more area to be taken over by Napoleon, by France, affecting our diplomatic position to many other countries. I think this is a much bigger problem than just they're arming Indians in the West and they're taking a few of our ships, which obviously is bad. I never like to see the loss of American life, but I think this has a much bigger meaning than just those little things. I don't think we're looking big enough.
I would also argue that your argument that British is at its weakest right now, trying to fend off France, just isn't looking into the future. It's pretty certain that France is going to win in Russia, I would say. And if they march down into India and cut off the British Empire's one of their biggest economic resources, then it would only stand to reason that they will get weaker and we can attack them. I think France is an unstoppable force personally, and I think that they will conquer that part of the world.
I would like to add that I don't believe that France is any way trying to play us. I believe if they were trying to play us, they wouldn't have accepted our offer for neutral trade. When we made the offer to both Britain and France for a neutral, basically respecting like neutral shipping or neutral trading, we told them that whoever accepted the terms, we wouldn't deal with the other, and France accepted immediately. I mean, I can see where this whole idea of potentially, falling to Napoleon comes up, but I don't believe that him accepting our offer is any way of him, trying to plant the seed of doing some shady behind the scenes, sketchy.
That would be true if he had fulfilled his promise to honor that. He didn't follow through. He promised that if he reinstated the non-intercourse acts, like restricting trade with Britain, he was going to all economic terms restricting the US imports in Europe would be lifted, but that never happened. So that would be true if he had followed through, but he was playing us because we took the bait, we reinstated those economic terms with Britain, and then we got played.
I respect your point, but I would also like to draw on the fact that you said a few ships. You understand that there is upwards of 1,800 ships, not a few, 1,800. I yield my time.
Wow, this has been, is there an answer to that? Yes, Trevor.
Well, I say, you say that 1,800 ships is a lot of ships. Those are all merchant ships. The entire British Navy has 500 ships right now. That's about a third of the huge number of ships you're talking about here. How can our Navy with 16 ships hope to go up against a force of 500 ships?
And also speaking to that point, the 170 gunboats that we have are nothing compared to the British warships. They would not stand past our own harbors. We don't have the resources to take on this action.
You talk about lives, but you're willing to gamble with the lives of countless servicemen who will be drafted to serve in this conflict.
I mean, I would love to use your logic against you. Aren't you gambling with the lives of the American people if they just show up on our shores and we're completely unprotected?
But I didn't send them to do that. They are gambling with their own lives. And I hate to turn my back on my people, but they need to know that these waters are unsafe. And right now, we're not prepared to protect them.
And to that point, if Madison had followed through with Jefferson's policy of a gunnery navy, or the gunboat navy, where he had continued to build up the 100 authorized gunboats that we were supposed to have, which he never followed through with, we would have protection at our harbors and they would never, be able to come in, but he didn't do that. So alas, here we are.
Do not let pride cloud your pragmatism, Mike.
Is it a tough debate?
Yes. Wow. I am definitely unsure now. And you both did it. I think each of you did a good job advancing your arguments. And I am less sure now than I was when we began. Let me just say, I forgot this. Suffolk has a partnership with the Washington Center, and at 12:45, we have someone from the Washington Center is going to come and tell us about their opportunities. So, so that's something, one reason I'm happy to keep listening to you guys argue this, and I know Carl is too, because this has been a revelation. So what did you get out of this debate? And you don't have to betray whether you agree or disagree with the points you were just making so articulately. What is a lesson you learned from this, looking at these arguments and then hearing the arguments of the other side?
One thing that I've learned, at least from our past, this debate and our last debate, is like there's plenty of to throw yourself in this situation, like before the war even starts. Like, we know the War of 1812 happens, but to put yourself in the situation before and try to think about it from these congressmen, just think about it from their standpoint, and try to debate these things. It's really tough because there's so many hypotheticals. Like, there really is so many hypotheticals. You can really only focus on what you know and proceed from there. It's really tough to make that decision.
Yeah. And we know how it turned out. They didn't know how it was going to turn out. In fact, until the very end, they didn't know how it was going to turn out. So so you have that great unknown. And anyone else thought? Yes, Sarah?
I was just gonna say how I think these debates really help me understand like how wide scope these issues are. I think when I initially was just like getting the information and building up my arguments, I kind of was in support of the other side, like that we should go to war. And so I think I almost convinced myself during this, and Trevor helped as well, but it was a big learning experience. Yeah, I think it was very interesting.
Yeah.
I think from this debate and the last debate, I've started to realize that almost all wars in history books are so glorious, but before they start, there's rarely ever a lot of support for them. So even World War II, which is probably one of the most righteous causes you could have had, there was very little support for.
Right. That's true.
There's one thing I learned from this. There's two sides to every story, really, and that there are valid reasons to start a war and not to start a war, but we know that in the end, war fever did burn very strongly. But it's interesting to see, what led up to that, because they don't talk about that in the history books.
I would definitely add to the struggles of the hypotheticals as well.
Sitting
here and we're trying to decide well, how long do we wait until the British are at our shores? Will they be at our shores? Do we wait until we build up our army more so that we're more prepared? Will they come at all? You just don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. So it's so hard to try to figure out how to prepare, because there's so much at stake too. Do we wait and build up our army more, but then they attack us? And it's just, it's a lot to think about.
There's a lot.
Yes. And I think to that point, wagering, what's more important and what's more valuable, human life versus, I don't know. It's it's a very difficult thing to, it's a very important thing that you have to do. And I understand how difficult that must have been.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was actually one part of the reading. It was just one small snippet of a sentence that stuck out to me, where it said the tension in American policy between profit and principle reached a breaking point. And that was talking about the Chesapeake Leopard crisis.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was really interesting, because it was I feel like that was kind of what a lot of the hypotheticals were about. You know what I mean? Do we focus on profit? I mean, we're making money, but we're losing ships. It's but do we do something about Britain and their acts of violence? It's really hard to make that decision.
It is. Yes.
As a public historian dealing with the general public, who often has, maybe a couple high school history classes under their belt and haven't done the work or the firsthand reading that you guys have already started doing, even for this class, I can tell you that one of the aspects of this that we confront all the time is that sort of predestined notion, right? That, I think Trevor called it, or Sarah called it, the glory of war, and this idea that I think the public tends to frequently walk away with this idea that not only were these things inevitable, but that the nation was unanimously, supportive or opposed to every action that Congress ever takes. And the idea that there were fierce political divisions in the country prior to Vietnam is I think something of a revelation to a lot of the general public today. But even starting at the very beginning of the nation, its earliest conflicts, we've already seen with, France and the Barbary States and now Britain, that the decision on what course the country was going to take was already highly in debate.
Yes. Yeah, and you brought up some of those real tensions. I mean, the New England states refusing to let their militias leave the states, and then actually, the war ostensibly fought for free trade and sailors' rights, and the part of the country most vested in that is the most opposed to the war because they see it as something else. They see the real purpose is to get Canada and not to, and again, bringing up the embargo. I mean, the party in power, if you're a New Englander, hadn't done much other than try to hurt your economy since it's been in power. And so now are we going to believe them that they're genuinely concerned about protecting American trade at sea? And this is really what Josiah Quincy is saying in his speech in January about maritime protection. So you have, it's a really complicated story. Yes, Trevor.
Do you think any of these incidents were kind of like the equivalent of the Boston Massacre, where like it was terrible, but maybe it was overblown to get support for the war?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good example that you're trying, and a couple of you use the phrase war hawks. We know that there is a group in Congress really pushing for the war, and they are really magnifying these events. And then the question is, France also had been seizing American merchant ships. So why aren't we going to war against France? And why now? When, Michael began by bringing up the Chesapeake and the Leopard, that was like 5 years ago. And the response wasn't war, it was an embargo. And now we're not in any better situation than we were then. In fact, worse situation as far as going to war against Britain. So yeah, so it's, definitely it's an attempt to do that. So you've given us a lot to think about. Other thoughts on this? Because it's really an interesting debate going on about this, and the war itself is really anomalous in a lot of ways. It's actually, you brought up the real tension over should the United States go to war, and the sensible reason is the British Order in Council about free trade or trade, and the British had revoked that 2 days before Congress declared war. Of course, no one in Congress knew that. And then at the end of the war, the peace treaty doesn't mention any of the causes of the war, doesn't mention impressment, doesn't mention the Orders in Council. It just says, well, any outstanding issues we'll have negotiations over. And so that's really an anomaly, that the war ends without any reference to the cause of the war. And you also have these, one reason we're here, of course, is because of the Constitution's sterling record in the war at sea and these great battles with the Guerriere and the Java. And, as a couple of you mentioned, the United States has 14 ships, the British have over 500. So if our strategy is one by one, let's take out the British fleet. Okay, you're going to have a lot more of these single combats, and the British aren't stupid. They say, we're not going to do that anymore. You're a British commander, you run into an American ship, don't engage. If you're a British commander with 2 ships, then yes. Or the British can send some of their fleet to blockade the American coast. And pretty much after 1812, with in December, you have Decatur's victory over the Java in December of 1812. British essentially blockade the American coast and keep most of the fleet bottled up. They have a lot more ships and they can do that. So, but then you also have the other naval story is what happens on the Great Lakes, where both the Americans and the British build fleets on the Great Lakes, and the Americans at Lake Erie and Lake Ontario defeat the British fleets, and this opens up the a new push into Canada. But yeah, so you have the real fight, the important naval battles. I'm sorry, Carl. Yes, Trevor.
I have a question about the ground fighting. I don't know if you know as much, but was guerrilla warfare common in this war too? Because in the Revolutionary War, like, it's justified where they're fighting for their basic freedoms, but in this war, I wonder if like it shows a lack of pride to not stand up and fight.
Well, it's a little different here because essentially you have two different ground wars going on at the same time. You know, the army, as a couple of you mentioned, was very small, but there is a war going on in the Ohio, in Lower Canada, involving the Shawnee, the British, and the army and militia from the West. And William Henry Harrison is the general in charge of much of that. And so a lot of that is happening between the Ohio River and Canada, actually most of it in Canada after the loss of Detroit, which Sean told us about last time. You have that war. And then there's the Creek War, a war against the Creeks in what is today Alabama. And that war has the biggest massacre of whites by Indians at Fort Mims in Alabama in August of 1813. Somewhere between 200, 300, and 500 people killed at Fort Mims by an attack by the Creeks. And there's a long story of the origins of the Creek War, which has a connection with Tecumseh's War. And then in 1814, the Battle at Horseshoe Bend, which is actually the biggest defeat of Indians by the American armies in the whole history of this conflict. So you have that war going on there. And of course, the Creeks are being supplied by the English through Pensacola. And so you have that kind of fighting happening. The British don't send an army until 1814 because they're preoccupied fighting Napoleon in Europe. And I see I've lost track of your question about guerrilla fighting, and I don't think I'm actually going to answer it. But you do have real fighting going on land, but you also have these other really strange things. You know, when Thomas MacDonough is the American commander building the fleet on Lake Champlain, and at some other point, Carl and I can argue about whether the Battle of Plattsburgh was actually the most important naval battle in American history. And it takes place, of course, between the White Mountains of New York and the Green Mountains of New Hampshire. He's building this fleet in Vermont, and he knows that along the roads and through the forest trails of Vermont, there are farmers driving their cattle north to sell to the British in Canada. They're not selling them to him or to the Americans. And along the border of New York and Canada, there is a town that the battle wars are raging around it. But this particular town, the armies pass by, and one reason is the chief citizen in the town is the biggest buyer of war bonds in the area. And so the Madison administration doesn't want to do anything to disturb this guy who's really playing both sides. So you have these real, we know a lot about this war, you know, from this, partly because there is such an intense opposition to it, who's ready to point out things like this, misdeeds and missteps by the administration, which seems to be bumbling through much of this. You know, James Madison is the last American president to appear at the front at a battle scene and try to direct the troops. And the last time it happens for a good reason. He nearly gets his head blown off by a cannonball. And then, of course, the militia he's trying to rally folds, and he winds up getting chased away, and as does the rest of his cabinet. It's really a disaster. So he is this bumbler, which is something that provokes the New England states into wanting to secede. And he is, too, the only president during wartime who does not expand the scope of the federal government or have the office of the president enlarge its powers. And on the one hand, that's probably a mistake. On the other hand, it proves that a republic can work, which is really what he's trying to do. But again, the New England states threatened to secede from the Union because of New England being so much under threat, but also because the Madison administration following the Jefferson administration has brought us to this point. Now, this is something you get from Josiah Quincy's speech about we're unprepared for war because of the incredible incompetence and malevolence of these administrations. But then, of course, with the treaty, Madison does have the good sense to send over really good negotiators. So this is actually probably the best diplomatic team the United States has ever sent. Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay, who is the Speaker of the House and had been one of the most fervent war hawks, and then James Byer, the Senator from Delaware. And the British are sending their ace diplomatic team to Vienna, to the Congress at Vienna, which is much more important to them. And the result is the peace treaty says, okay, we'll simply go back to the way things were before the war. Neither side will keep any territory that it's occupying, and we'll resolve all the differences later on. The British, by this time, simply want to end the war because now Napoleon has gotten out and is back marching through Europe. So you have that. Yeah, it's the delegation from the Hartford Convention with Harrison, Gray, Otis, and others. The Hartford Convention met in December of 1814 in Hartford. And this is after Washington had been burned. There's this huge British army on its way to the Mississippi River. And you also have this British army preparing to come down Lake Champlain. It had been stopped in early September. And the British army that burned Washington had also been stopped at Baltimore in September. But you still have this British force going to the Mississippi River. And former President Jefferson believes that they're probably going to take the Mississippi River. And Chief Justice Marshall had suggested that Madison should resign as president and let the Senate appoint Rufus King to be the new president. King had been the ambassador to England, and he probably could negotiate a way out of this mess. So you have really serious people saying this war is a disaster. And these guys from New England aren't kooks. They really are legitimately trying to hold on to something here. And they think that the Virginians have really brought on this catastrophe. And so they meet in early December and they decide to give the administration one more chance. They'll present Madison with some demands. And then if he doesn't accede to them, then New England will secede. And they arrive in Washington with their demands. It turns out on the same day that news arrives from Ghent that we've made a treaty with the British. We didn't lose anything. So the war has ended and we actually didn't lose. But also news arrives from New Orleans of Jackson's victory there over this massive British army. And that gives the idea that not only did we not lose, we actually won because we repulsed this. And by the way, the British army going to the Mississippi River were the same troops that had defeated Napoleon's armies in Spain. Doesn't have their commander. The Duke of Wellington didn't want to be part of this, but it's his troops go. So if you think Napoleon, the French army, greatest army of all time, these are the troops that defeated them. Now we've defeated them. So in the great scheme of things, this does make it a big victory. I see Sarah wiping tears from her eyes as I'm recounting this story of the victory at New Orleans. And so suddenly James Madison goes from being this bumbler who brought on this catastrophe to being the wise statesman who saw us through this and led to victory. It's one of the most improbable stories. There are lots of improbable stories, and there's not the least Constitution defeating the Guerriere, the Java, and then as Charles Hardmon was saying, Stewart defeating two ships simultaneously in, was that in 1815? So that was in January of 1815? Carl? Because
Yeah,
you have some of these battles. Yeah, some of these battles are happening after the war actually was over because they'd agreed to the peace terms on on Christmas Eve of 1814. But you have Stewart encountering the Cyane and the Levant and taking on two ships and beating them both. At one point, he sails between them, and it's so you have all of these improbable stories, which is one of the things that makes it such an interesting war.
Yeah, I think to echo some of that, from the standpoint of Constitution, right, from the focus of class, you asked Bob whether I would agree with you on the Battle of Plattsburgh, and I'm kind of with you on that one. One of the aspects from a sort of naval standpoint, one of the aspects of Constitution is that these individual ship duels that Constitution was having out in the open ocean had a lot of impact in terms of the broader sort of swath of naval history because of the nature of this sort of uniquely designed ship and America's arrival on the international scene as a naval power. But the bitter reality of it is that these victories were surprising in their level of success, and they did the same thing that Professor Allison was just talking about in terms of astonishing support, gathering support among the Americans who and really boosting morale. But from a strategic or tactical standpoint, these one-on-one ship duels didn't really do a damn thing for winning the war. The real center point of this war from a military standpoint, both ground or naval, was on the lakes. And that's where, as you've just described, Champlain, the Mississippi Delta, the rest of the lakes campaigns were really fundamental. A vast number of sailors who finished their tour of duty on Constitution after each of these first two big victories end up getting sent off to the Great Lakes Station next. And are staying there to continue working in that fight. So, it was a morale booster and it rallied Americans around it, but it definitely was not, it was not the tactical or strategic victory that won the war by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and Oliver Hazard Perry had been on gunboats in Rhode Island, and he realized if he actually wanted to do something, he would have to go to the Great Lakes, which wasn't something he necessarily wanted to do. No one did, and so you do have the much more critical thing. I'm reminded too that Decatur was bottled up in New London for most of the war. I do have a lot of interesting pictures I was going to show you of the war, but you have, he's bottled up at New London with the British fleet off the coast, but he is in correspondence with the British fleet, the commanders of it. And one of their questions was, what was it that led to the American victories over the British? And some of the British officers insisted it's because most of the crew of the American ships actually are British. And who are the better sailors? And they actually have two ships because Decatur had captured the Macedonian, which is a British built ship. And one of its sister ships is in the fleet off of New London. Well, how about we'll have an American crew on the Macedonian and a British crew on this British ship, and they'll have a single ship duel. And that way we'll see, is it the ships that are better or is it the crew that's better? And this, the thing that stopped, two things stopped it. One, Decatur is afraid, since the British have an entire fleet, they will pick their best men to be on their ship. So they're negotiating who exactly will be in the crew of each one. And then word gets to Washington, and President Madison hears that they're planning to have this single ship duel just to see who is better. And he said he can't do that. You know, you can't have this, satisfying as it might be to have this duel, because to be honest, neither the British nor the Americans actually are doing anything here. But on the other hand, the Americans, there are a couple of innovations that happen. As Carl said, it's these single ship duels which make for great stories and would be great set pieces. And when we make the movie, we're going to have the Guerriere and the Java and the Cyan and the Levant. Yeah, but on the other hand, the Americans realize they're fighting against a much bigger force. And one of the things you want to do if your enemy has a bigger force is try to neutralize it. And fortunately for the Americans, back in 1803, when an American delegation had gone off to negotiate for the purchase of Louisiana, in France, they met Robert Fulton, who's an American, and he was in France trying to convince Napoleon that he should invest in what Fulton called torpedoes, underwater explosive that can blow up ships, because Napoleon, like the Americans, was fighting against a power that had a bigger navy than he did. And so what he was hoping, what Fulton was proposing is, you can't build the ships to fight the British, but you can blow up the ships the British have. And it seems like Fulton's real interest in life, we know he ultimately is credited with the steamboat, but his real fascination seemed to be not getting ships to move through the water, but blowing ships out of the water. And Livingston, one of the negotiators, meets Fulton and thinks this is just the kind of inventive guy we want to come home and work on the steamboat, which Fulton does. Couldn't convince Napoleon to get into torpedo warfare. So comes home, develops the steamboat. 1807, the Claremont sails up the Hudson River. And then Fulton turns his attention back to his first love, blowing things up. And in fact, in 1811, he wrote a book called Torpedo Warfare, saying this is the future of naval warfare, not pitched battles between ships at sea, but underwater devices that can blow ships out of the water. And he writes this book, sends copies to everyone in the Navy, and the officers in the Navy tend to be a pretty conservative bunch. They don't like this kind of innovation. And Fulton is a guy that people either thought this guy is a genius or they thought this guy is a raving lunatic. And most of the officers in the Navy were of the raving lunatic school. One person who was of the genius school was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson, now a former president, persuades the Navy they have to let Fulton try this thing out. So they do give a test. And I think John Rogers is involved in it in New York Harbor. And so they see what Fulton is proposing. You have an underwater stationary mine. It hits the hull of the ship and blows it up. Well, what they do is put a big net around the hull of the ship. And so the ship sails in and it brushes aside these mines, they're torpedoes as they were called, that Fulton has put there. And Fulton looks like a big fool. They've outsmarted him, but he's the kind of big fool who thinks, why didn't it work? Well, it was because of this netting. So what we have to do is figure out a way to cut this net. And so what Fulton starts working on is a vessel that can actually go very close to the water line, and under the water, it'll have long spikes with these. Well, actually, the first idea is like a big underwater pair of scissors that can cut the net. But it's from that kind of crazy idea. And he actually has an underwater gun that can shoot this underwater pair of scissors. Well, if you can do that, why don't you just have an underwater gun that actually could shoot the explosive? So you can see what he's developing here is really a prototypical submarine, something that's going to go very close to the water line. There had been things that went under the water and can fire something at the hull of a ship. So this is something he is working on. And the big problem with something like this, and it's going to have a steam engine on it in order to get closer to the enemy. You have to get very close to the enemy ship in order to do this, because you don't have a cannon that can fire underwater at a great range. So you have to have a vessel with a very steeply sloped deck, because what's going to happen, you get close to the enemy ship, they're going to board you and take it over. And boarding, we've talked about. So you can see these different challenges as Fulton is developing this idea. And of course, the one captain in the Navy who thinks this makes any sense is Stephen Decatur, who's bottled up in New London. And so Decatur and Fulton are working on this prototype, and Fulton then is given permission to develop a steam-powered warship that can do these things, which they call the Demologos, the voice of the people, or the voice. So this is the first steam-powered warship in the history of the world that Fulton is building in New York, preparing for that army that's coming down Lake Champlain, where there are really no defenses, and take New York. So he's trying to get this ready in time. And then there's another British fleet on Lake Ontario. So the Navy Department asks Fulton, can you build another one and send it to Lake Ontario, or send the one you're building to Lake Ontario? You can see this is in December of 1814, or the fall of 1814, when we're preparing for this invasion. Again, we all know the war is going to end in early 1815, but no one at the time knows. Just as when you were doing your debate, you're pretending we don't know how this decision is being made. So you have the possibility of the first steam-powered warship that's going to be able to fire underwater explosives, but the war ends, so it's not used. And the idea is going to lay dormant for almost 100 years. So you have these real anomalous pieces to this war. And by the way, after this, Fulton dies shortly after this. And the more traditional members of the officer corps go back to thinking, boy, that guy really was a nut. And who wants a steam-powered warship because you have to carry a lot of coal, they're slow moving, the engines are noisy, and they blow up. Much better sticking with big wooden sailing vessels. So, any questions about any of this, or further thoughts? Or anyone changed their mind about whether we should or should not have gone to war in 1812?
Fulton was right about the future.
Fulton was right. Yes, he was right.
Engines and torpedoes became the normal standard.
They did. But one interesting thing is too, when countries began using them really at the time, the Confederacy used them during the Civil War, used mines, which then were called torpedoes. And then when the Germans used them in World War I, the country and the Japanese used them in World War II. The countries which had not adopted them saw this as a barbaric thing to be doing. And because they didn't have to. So you have really, it is a change in warfare that's beginning to happen at the time of the War of 1812. It's interesting, the Navy doesn't really get into steam power until very close to, or if not after, the Civil War. They will use steam engines at Navy yards to do that kind of manual work, but steam power to propel a ship comes about a bit later. And the other big thing, that the culmination of the War of 1812 too, was the, how shall we put this? Well, the real interest of the country turns to the interior. A number of you pointed this out. We have this continent to develop. And after the war, one of the big things that happens, of course, is the attention of the country turns inward. But also another way the War of 1812 is somewhat anomalous is after the war, we realize a Navy is really an important thing. And so actually the United States expands its Navy after the war. And the Republicans, the party who had been in power, always had been a little suspicious of the Navy. But the fighting of the war convinces them that a Navy is really a valuable thing. And they see the officers of the Navy as safer than the hero from the Army, who turns out to become this charismatic figure who's going to change American politics in the 1820s and 1830s, Andrew Jackson. There's actually one of my favorite stories about Jackson and Decatur in 1818. Jackson, as you may know, and I'm sorry if I've just gone off onto a tangent, and if there are other Navy-related things we should talk about with other than Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans. who's in 1816 or 1817, Jackson invades Florida, which is a Spanish possession, and takes Pensacola. And he's actually chasing people who are fugitives from slavery who have left Georgia going south. And Jackson goes south. He burns the Negro Fort, as it was called, on the Apalachicola River, then takes Pensacola. And this could provoke a war with Spain if Spain were in a condition to go to war against the United States. And the cabinet has a debate about what to do about Jackson. Should he be censured and cashiered? And the cabinet decides no. And then someone in the Senate investigates Jackson. You're going to see that happening. One thing Congress will do is launch investigations of things for, Congress doesn't really need a justification for doing this, but it's something Congress does. And the report indicates that Jackson has friends who own real estate around Pensacola, and that maybe what Jackson was just trying to do was bolster his friends' real estate portfolios. And Jackson is outraged, and he declares he's going to go to Washington, march into the Senate, and cut off the ears of the senator who had made this allegation. I see our friends from the Washington Center are approaching, so we'll have to wait for next week to find out what happens with Andrew Jackson invading Washington in 1818.
Oh, I love a good cliffhanger.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. How are you?
Good. How are you guys?
Good. So this is a class, we're just wrapping up. So are you ready to tell us about the Washington Center?
I sure am. Yeah. And I have a little PowerPoint to share with you guys. So I'll pull that up real
Wonderful.
quick. All right. So hi, everyone. Thanks for letting me visit today to talk about the academic internship program at the Washington Center and the National Security Seminar that we offer students as well. So first, I'll just talk really quick about the National Security Seminar. It's a one-week virtual seminar to explore the protection of U.S. interests at home, abroad, and online. So you're going to interact with some national security experts who tackle these issues every day and gain a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities in this interesting field. So some things you're going to gain from this seminar are, a deeper understanding of national security, connect with other students who are also interested in the field, and gain some valuable insights from experts in the field of national security. There's also an opportunity to earn some academic credit for this seminar. So the seminar is made up of 3 components. You're going to be hearing from some distinguished speakers and public national security experts from Washington, D.C., some educational briefings to help you virtually explore Washington, D.C., and then we'll meet into some small group sessions so you guys can kind of digest what you're learning in that day. So some of our speakers in the past have included a program manager at the Department of Homeland Security, Dr. Dan Massey, former CIA director, John Brennan. So we've had some pretty notable speakers come and speak to students on the topic of national security. The educational briefings, you might explore some government agencies, some think tanks, media outlets, and lots more, just to get kind of an insider's view as to, what goes on in Washington, D.C., get a, insider's look at how the nation's capital works. So some past educational briefings include the Metropolitan Police Department of Homeland Security Bureau, Department of Energy Insider Threat Program, and the Center for Strategic and International Students. So like I said, that third component is small groups. So you kind of break off into smaller groups with other students. It's faculty led, just an opportunity for some candid discussion, speak with other students about what you're learning and help you digest all that information. So the cost of the seminar is included in your Suffolk tuition as a summer course. Sorry, I don't know why I said that so weird, as a summer course. And undergraduates can receive 4 credits for the seminar. Graduate students can receive 3 credits for the seminar. So I really encourage you to speak to your campus liaison, Christina, about any outstanding questions you might have about the cost or credit arrangement for participating in this seminar. And I'll drop her email in the chat
Actually, I'm putting it in right now. I'm sorry to have joined late.
Yes,
Oh, no
Professor
problem.
Kulich is here, who is from our government or public policy department. And
Great.
so thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and if you wouldn't mind, I'll add a couple of extra pieces of information, and I've been busily putting things in the chat box while Kayla is giving you a rundown about this summer one course. So it is a full summer one elective course. There is that intense week that we spend remotely at the Washington Center, but we will continue throughout summer one with a sort of independent study kind of format. I will be arranging to have guest speakers on a rotating basis, and some of them involve having Suffolk alum come and speak to us. My favorite Suffolk alum for this program, as a matter of fact, is a guy who was an English major here at Suffolk a very long time ago, and then spent 45 years as a spy in the CIA. He was involved in everything from the hunt for Bosnian war criminals to trying to find out whether or not Saddam Hussein actually did have a program of a nuclear program or was producing weapons of mass destruction. And he also served as CIA bureau chief in Paris for about a decade. So those are the types of opportunities that come along with this summer elective course. Plus the fact that you would join, you would become a TWC alum, which is an organization which is about 60,000 strong. So it's a really, really interesting way to earn 4 elective credits over the course of the summer. So I'm going to let Kayla continue on, and I think she's about to talk to you about internship programs. But in the chat, I dropped a link to inauguration seminar, which was the last seminar that, well, actually it's still happening. It's a spring course, but it's a story that our communications department wrote about how this remote seminar experience went. And it'll give you an idea of what national security will look like. There's also a copy of the national security flyer. We had an information session, I don't know, about a week, maybe a week and a half ago. It's kind of hard to tell time on Zoom. Everything gets conflated. But if you click on the links here and enter your information to register, it will bring you to a recording of the event. And then finally, there is a checklist here which tells you everything that you need to know about process to apply to either the seminars or the internship programs that we're going to talk about now. And my email is there. So the process of getting involved in either seminars or internship programs actually starts with me. So sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Thank you for that extra info. Yeah, so like you're saying, there's a lot of opportunities to be a part of the TWC community. The seminar is just one of them. So before I switch over to the academic internship program, I'll just real quick show you this slide. The application deadline for the seminar is March 31st. So that's coming up, in a couple of weeks. You have a little bit of time there to get your application in if you're interested. And the seminar dates are May 24th to the 28th. So just a little bit of information there about the seminar. And then we'll switch tracks over to this academic internship program. So whether you join us for a summer or a semester at the Washington Center, you can either join us in person, stay in our residential and academic housing facility located in the heart of Washington, D.C., or you can participate remotely from the comfort of your own home. So regardless of how you choose to participate in the program, we guarantee to deliver some essential parts of our holistic program, which are the internship, the academic course, and some career preparation and readiness components as well. So the internship is arguably the most important part of the program. We're partnered with over 400 different internship sites in and around the DC area. So we work with you one-on-one to select an internship that's right for you. You have an advisor that really gets to know you, gets to know your interests, your background, what you're looking for in an internship. And they, send your application materials out to these internships that they think will suit you best. So it really is, a great way to get connected with some awesome internships and very little, work on your part to get these application materials out to these internship sites. So once you begin your internship, you'll be working on projects related to your interests with a supervisor that's really invested in your success. That's what we work really hard at, trying to get you an internship that you're not just getting coffee and making copies for people, you're really actively involved in the work of the organization and getting some practical skills and experience. So that's that first component of the program. The second is the evening course or the academic course. So while your internship will be the core part of your time at the Washington Center, you'll also be taking an academic course one night a week. You'll be able to choose a course based on your interests, gain access to faculty members who not only work as professors, but also as leading professionals in their industry. So it's a really cool opportunity to, again, hear from some really prominent people in their field and get some of the information you would be getting in a classroom, but from an insider's perspective. So you'll be taking that, one night a week, and you could receive academic credit for it as well. That's something, maybe I'll let Professor Coolidge talk a little bit more about if you'd like to speak on that now.
Yeah, sure. So the Washington Center does not grant academic credit, Suffolk does. So when you take these internship programs or the seminar programs, you are enrolled in Suffolk courses, you pay Suffolk tuition, you pay nothing to Washington Center, and you receive Suffolk credit. The courses, the internship courses, as well as the seminar courses, are overseen by Suffolk faculty, and the grades that you earn while doing these things also count towards your GPA. So unlike study away or study abroad or transfer credits, they don't arrive on your transcript as pass fail. They are graded and count toward GPA. So the really nice thing about the fall and the spring 16 credit internship program in particular is that you are paying whatever you would be paying with the financial package that you have at Suffolk already. Registered in Suffolk courses, you're still at Suffolk. You also do work for me. We meet bi-monthly in order to keep tabs on how your internship is going, and you do some additional projects that leverage the work that you're doing on the ground, on the job, with your course of academic studies. So it makes it that much more of a robust experience. And the last thing I'll say about it is that should you choose the in residence option, at this point, Suffolk still is not charging an additional housing fee. So you can be in DC without paying for additional housing, which is a pretty significant benefit. And I can also tell you, we've been fighting tooth and nail to keep that as is and not have this be an additional cost that students have to bear. So keep those things in mind. So fall and spring are 16 credits. You take 2 courses. One course is 12 credits that covers the internship, the career and professional development piece that the Washington Center does so well, and also the work that you'll be doing for me remotely. And then the other course is the 4 credits for the evening course that you take. Right now, because of the pandemic and because of the arrangement we have with the Washington Center is also allowing Suffolk students to have a choice of either taking a course that's offered by the Washington Center or to take a course at Suffolk if it's online and can fit into your schedule, or if you've chosen the remote option and you're near campus anyway. And that flexibility is really, really important for a lot of students, because you may have that one pesky remaining required course for your major. I know that this semester I have 2 students who are in our accelerated master's program. So they're technically in their senior year, but they're required to take graduate level courses. The dean's office wouldn't waive this in any way. So they are able to intern through TWC and take a grad class and remain in their accelerated program. So I think that all of those things are pretty amazing benefits for our students. And I would not be spending my time or asking your professor for time from his class if I didn't think that this was a really good opportunity for our students of all majors.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's a great point. It is good for all majors. And that third component is career preparation and readiness, like you were saying. And it's definitely something that sets the Washington Center apart from any other kind of internships, to really help you reflect and on your internship experience, asking yourself those questions like, what am I liking? What am I not liking? What am I really good at? What would I like to learn more about? So this, this aspect includes, professional development workshops, career exploration sessions, one-on-one career advising, networking events. So like Professor Coolidge is saying, it's definitely a really holistic experience. We want you to not only get that internship experience, but we want you to build on it with an academic course. And we want to give you opportunities and resources to build on your network, and get some more, valuable experience and skills to apply to your career after graduation.
And just to give you an idea of some of what students are telling me about what they like in the new career and professional development program that TWC has kind of retooled, is that they're given a menu of different things to do depending on where they are or where you are in your job search, life, career preparation. And those include things like LinkedIn workshops to how to negotiate a salary. Mm-hmm. And everything in between. So it really is customized to meet you where you are. And it's the kind of thing that is incredibly valuable, especially now given the state of the economy. You want to start out with as many advantages that set you apart from anyone else in building your own brand and building on the skill set you've already got.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. So, like Professor Coolidge was saying earlier, the TWC community is huge. There's always over 60,000 alumni, all people you can reach out to, ask about their experience, ask how they got into their career field, and maybe get a foot in the door professionally. Another great part of our program is, a lot of students are networking, they're getting opportunities for employment after graduation. So it's definitely, something you can really do to set yourself up for success.
So I think that's pretty close to the end of what we want to say. I just want to echo or amplify what Kayla is saying about networking. I can tell you many, many anecdotes of students who have either parlayed their internship into a job immediately, or who have gotten a job because of that TWC connection, because it's something that really stands out on a resume, or because of the skill set that they've built. I'll also say that over our 40-year partnership, there is a really robust community of TWC Suffolk alumnus out there who are a great resource.
Definitely. So if you do have any questions, I'd love to answer them. You're welcome to put them in the chat. I'm not sure quite about this format, but maybe you're able to speak on your microphone as well. I'm not quite sure about that one.
Yes, they are. Thank you. This has been very interesting. I know we do have a number of students that I foresee will be running the country at some point. So in this particular cohort. So
that's great.
If you have any questions for Professor Coolidge or for Kayla.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us the time. If you've got any questions or want to think about where this fits into your program evaluation, or go ahead and apply, again, the route to start all of that is through me at Suffolk. And if you want more general information about the Washington Center and how to do what you need to do, definitely reach out through those links that Kayla provided for you. So we will take up no more time in your class, and thank you once again for your hospitality and allowing us in.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Take care.
Okay, well, it's a great program, and I know a number of you should be interested in it. So any further questions? I realize we're beyond our time. Carl and I always are happy to talk about the Constitution and the War of 1812, but I know you all have lives to get back to. So I'll let you do that. So thank you. Interesting debate today, and I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you.
Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Bob. Have a good one.
Good to see you. Take care.